June 6, 1944, 2:30 a.m. 12 miles off the coast of Normandy, the English Channel is a churn of slate and oil under a cloud-split sky. Cold spray slaps faces, metal shutters, and the steady throb of hundreds of Liberty ship engines vibrates through timber decking and through the bones of men. In the dim glow of blackout lamps, a line of low, boxy craft rides bow into the swell like a slow-moving metal tide. They are LCVPs, landing craft, vehicle, personnel. And on this morning they carry everything the Allies hope will break Hitler's Atlantic bulwark. You are crouched behind a canvas bulkhead, shoulder to shoulder with a corporal from Omaha's 1st Infantry Division, whose palms are white around the strap of his M1 Garand. The smell is diesel and salt and old rope. Somewhere close a man retches. Ahead, the ramp is a rectangle of shadow that will, in less than an hour, become a mouth of flame and shrapnel. Men whisper last-minute prayers or none at all the portable rituals that fix courage to the wrist and heart, while the coxswain calls over his shoulder, voice rough as the sea, 5 minutes. Keep your bayonets on. Aboard the craft, the crew moves like a machine built for a single purpose. The pilot, Lieutenant Thomas Harrow, a plucky 32-year-old from Norfolk, eases the throttle forward. The Higgins boat answers with a low, obedient roar. The craft's shallow draft rides over the channel's irregular troughs. The hull barely feels the swell. Inside the boat, 70 soldiers crouch on wooden benches, helmets hugged tight, equipment stowed but heavy with the imminent knowledge of where it will be used. An enlisted man checks the jam on his Browning automatic rifle. The metallic click loud as thunder in the close quarters. Someone hums an off-key hymn. Another whispers to a photograph tucked beneath a dog tag. Off to starboard flashes bloom, tracer arcs and fold of orange where naval gunfire does its patient work. Destroyers grind out patterns of suppression, but the real gamble lies in these small, flat-bottomed boats that will carry infantry from the relative safety of the transports to the teeth of the Atlantic wall. They are simple, a box-like hull of plywood and steel, a folding bow ramp held by heavy chains, a welded ramp winch, and a gasoline engine at the stern driving a single propeller. There is no armor to speak of, only the courage of those within, and the shallow draft that will let them ride where deeper keel warships cannot. 5 minutes, Harrow repeats, eyes narrowing into the dark. He knows every man in his boat by the sound of his breath. He knows, too, the rumor, whispered in the wardrooms, of how these boats were made, a civilian's answer to a military problem. You can sense it in the tight efficiency of the crew, in the way the LCVP noses forward, compelled not by grandeur, but by a straightforward American faith in getting things done. As dawn lifts, the shoreline unrolls like a map come to violent life. The concrete skeletons of bunkers, the dark angular scars of anti-tank obstacles known as Czech hedgehogs, the barbed wire strung in rough, stubborn loops across sand. A German machine gun bunker on a small rise opens its throat and spits. The first rounds strike the LCVP's ramp, a clatter like a dropped toolbox, and the craft shudders. Men grunt and curse. A burst of flak rakes past. Rust-colored spray of beach sand erupts. Then the critical order, stand by to go in, stand by to go in. The ramp chains are unshackled. The bow drops with a metallic groan, clanging on the beach like a dropped drawbridge. In that instant, the LCVP becomes a theatrical stage, the men its actors cast toward chaos. For a breath everything holds, the surf, the churned sand, the machinery of war. Then the first man stands, steps out into a shallow, seething world where every footfall might be the last. Across the channel, the German defenders, Wehrmacht infantry, Kriegsmarine detachments, and Waffen-SS units dug into the concrete, had expected an invasion of sorts. They had built steel and concrete to deny anyone a foothold. What they had not fully understood was how quickly, how repeatedly men could be planted on their beaches. The LCVP's genius is not in its armor or guns. It is in its arithmetic. Small, shallow, and inexpensive to produce, these boats multiplied like a swarm and moved with a speed and rhythm that turned amphibious assault from a rare, complex operation into something industrial. A steady, grinding procession of men and vehicles from sea to sand. This morning, as the ramp clangs and the first men pour into surf and gunfire, that calculus will be proven. The Higgins boat is more than a transport. It is a tool of surprise. It allows entire companies and then battalions to be landed across stretches of shoreline that would have defeated heavier craft. The German commanders on the bluff will blink at what appears to be an endless line of small craft, each disgorging troops with alarming regularity. They had fortified against tanks and heavy landing barges, not these low-slung, hard-to-target boats that ride the surf in numbers their charts did not anticipate. A young sergeant named James Calloway slaps his thigh to find his footing as the surf narrows his world to a single, wet, luminous corridor. He feels the weight of the world in his webbed pack. He tastes salt and iron. He does not think about logistics or design history. He thinks only of the sand ahead and the men shouting behind him. Yet each step is an argument for a different kind of warfare, one that began not in a general staff room, but in a civilian yard, where a man named Andrew Higgins took a swamp boat and turned it into a machine that could land men anywhere. The ramp sinks into the wet sand. Boots slap. Metal screams. A shell cracks overhead and a man behind you falls. The sound of the impact, a terrible punctuation. On the cliff above, a German lieutenant shouts into a phone, bewildered at the cadence of the landings, again and again, wave after wave, and realizes that his calculations, his expectations, are being outpaced by something he had not hoped to see. An industrialized tide of men, launched by small, shallow boats that do not wait for the sea to be perfect. 30 years before Normandy, long before a German lieutenant stared in disbelief at the rising tide of Allied infantry, the idea for the Higgins boat was rocking quietly in a muddy Louisiana bayou. It is 1910, and a wiry young man named Andrew Jackson Higgins stands ankle-deep in brackish water, a cigarette pinched in the corner of his mouth, watching his workers try and fail to move a stubborn log raft out of a shallow inlet. Mosquitoes cloud the air. Cypress trunks rise like ancient pillars around him. The humidity is a wet hand pressed against the lungs. Higgins squints at the scene. "Too much draft," he mutters. "Too damn much." The boat they're using rides too deep. It snags on every submerged root and sandbar. He spits into the water, steps forward, and slaps the hull with the back of his hand, as if disciplining a lazy mule. Higgins is a man who sees problems as if they were written in bold letters, and even at this age he has the habit of sketching solutions on whatever surface is closest: receipt paper, crate lids, shirt cuffs. By evening he's pacing his small workshop in New Orleans, tracing an idea in the dusty air: a flat-bottomed hull, a sharply raked bow, something that can skim across mud, marsh, and debris fields without sticking. Something light, something fast, something that doesn't fight the water but glides over it like a water strider. He builds the first prototype, crude, uneven, ugly, but it floats where other boats choke. When he pilots it through the bayou, it slides over snags and roots with the easy arrogance of a creature that has finally found its home. Fishermen notice, loggers notice, oil companies notice. Soon the Higgins Industries' Eureka boat becomes a staple in the Gulf Coast's rough waters. What no one realizes, not yet, is that this strange little swamp craft will one day become the backbone of the largest amphibious invasion in human history. 1941. New Orleans. The air tastes of oil and hot metal as a U.S. Navy procurement officer named Commander Arthur Ryden steps into Higgins's workshop. He expects another pitch from another civilian boat builder, someone who will waste his time with big talk and small capability. Instead, Higgins jabs a finger at him and says, "Get in." The officer blinks. "Excuse me?" Higgins points again, impatient. "In the boat." They motor out into a shallow delta where the water is barely 2 feet deep. Ryden crosses his arms, unimpressed, until Higgins cranks the throttle. The boat rises, skimming effortlessly across water so thin it might as well be painted onto the mud. Ryden watches the shoreline slide sideways. He hears the engine hum, the hull whisper, the shallow draft doing exactly what it was born to do: ignore obstacles completely. Then Higgins cuts the engine, lets the boat drift toward a muddy bank, and says, "Imagine 30 infantrymen in the back. Imagine they don't have to jump over the sides. Imagine they can run straight out the front. But this boat doesn't have a—" It will. A bow ramp. A simple hinge and winch system. A door that drops like a jaw, turning the front of the craft into a sprinting lane. Ryden's eyes widen. In this moment, the Navy officer sees something the War Department has been starving for: a way to deliver men, vehicles, and equipment onto hostile shores without forcing them to tumble awkwardly over gunnels or drop into water too deep to fight in. "And we can build thousands," Higgins adds, "fast." Ryden's answer is a slow, astonished exhale. By 1942, Higgins Industries is no longer a modest shipyard. It is an empire of workshops, assembly lines, and welding bays scattered across New Orleans, running 24 hours a day. Men, women, and teenagers, many of them with no prior industry experience, pour in from across the state. Some weld for the first time in their lives, some stitch canvas, some rivet. Higgins walks the factory floors with a clipboard tucked under his arm and a fury of energy that seems to ripple the air around him. He fires foremen who move too slowly. He promotes janitors who think creatively. He curses without apology. He demands perfection, but forgives honest mistakes. Where Henry Ford brought the moving assembly line to cars, Higgins brings it to boats. The U.S. Navy, deeply skeptical at first, now can't get enough of him. They send officers to study his methods. They print glowing reports. They call him the man who is winning the war from the Gulf Coast. By late 1943, he has 30,000 employees, most of them ordinary Americans who have never seen a battlefield, but whose hands now build the craft that will carry others into the fire. Higgins stands on a balcony overlooking one of his main factories, an enormous warehouse that smells of pine planking, diesel, and hot steel, and watches an LCVP slide down the rails into the Mississippi. It hits the water with a proud splash. "Next!" he shouts. Another boat follows. Then another. A rhythm. A heartbeat. A tide. Thousands of miles away, German intelligence officers study aerial photos of British ports. They count ships. They map barracks. They measure dry dock widths. But what they cannot see, what they cannot imagine, is the vast American production ecosystem that is building a fleet of shallow draft landing craft faster than they can be photographed. For every one Higgins boat the Germans destroy in rehearsal raids or convoy attacks, 10 more roll off the lines. They think the Allies will land with large, deep-draft barges. They expect slow unloading, predictable patterns, bottlenecks. But Higgins has created something else entirely. A way to place men on any shoreline, at any tide, at any hour, faster than defenders can reposition. It is a logistical miracle masked in plywood and steel. When German analysts brief the Atlantic Wall commanders, they show diagrams of expected landing craft types. None of them look like the squat, humble, unstoppable Higgins boat. It is the blind spot that will change the war. May 1944, northern France. In the bunker complex at Pointe du Hoc, Oberleutnant Karl Voss leans over a sand-dusted map illuminated by a flickering bulb. The concrete room smells of oil, damp wool, and the stale metallic breath of machines left too long underground. Outside, the wind moans against the embrasure slits like a restless animal, dragging salt and seaweed smells into the corridors. Voss taps a pencil against the blue grease markings tracing the expected Allied invasion routes. "Their landing craft will be slow," he mutters to his staff sergeant. "Deep draft, vulnerable approaches. They must come in at high tide. They cannot land armor directly unless the tide is perfect." This is the logic the Atlantic Wall is built upon. It is the logic German planners have rehearsed since '42. Every obstacle, every seawall, every minefield is arranged around the assumption that enemy craft must commit early, must navigate deep channels, must approach in narrow vectors dictated by tide and draft. What Voss does not know, what none of them know, is that dozens of Allied intelligence teams have already photographed these very diagrams. They have read the German assumptions the way a chess master reads an opponent's opening move, and they know something the bunker crews do not. The Higgins boat does not care about German tide charts. Across the channel, on the decks of troop transports, thousands of LCVPs are slung from davits like steel fruit, rows of them clanging softly in the wind. Sailors run last checks, bilge pumps, lines, fuel levels, the chatter of the Chrysler Marine engine coughing and then purring awake. One coxswain, Petty Officer Milton Avery, wipes salt spray from his eyebrows with the back of his sleeve. He is 22 years old, lean as a sapling, and already experienced enough to recognize the scent of coming battle. He runs his hand along the plywood hull, sturdy yet light, rough in places but never weak. Higgins had insisted on it. The wood must flex, must ride atop the water, must not split when shoved into surf like a battering ram. On the deck beside him, a British colonel from the 231st Brigade eyes the LCVP skeptically. "This little box," he says, "this is what's meant to put us ashore?" Avery grins. "Sir, you'll be surprised how many blokes she spits onto a beach before breakfast." The colonel doesn't answer, but his expression shifts when he notices the dropped ramp, the open snout, the simple genius of the design. He imagines suddenly men pouring out in seconds rather than climbing awkwardly over gunnels. He imagines hitting sand before defenders can correct their aim. He imagines speed. He imagines something the Germans have not accounted for. 3 nights before D-Day, German coastal watch stations record strange sonar reflections. Dozens, then hundreds of small signatures moving in wide arcs across the channel. But the reports are dismissed. "No landing craft can maneuver in those numbers," one Kriegsmarine officer writes. "It must be decoys, or fishing vessels, or weather interference." The truth is that the shallow draft LCVPs are operating in waters too thin for U-boats to patrol and too unpredictable for standard sonar to interpret cleanly. Their movements do not match the patterns the Germans are trained to recognize. They confound the algorithms of expectation. Invisible not by stealth, but by being the last thing the enemy thought they'd see. June 6th. Before dawn. The sea is ink and rising wind. Miles-long columns of LCVPs swing out from transport ships like the joints of a giant mechanical creature unfurling its limbs. Coxswains gun their engines. Wakes crisscross and fan wide. The craft settle into arrow-headed formations that spread across the channel like an invading tide of shoebox-sized shadows. The German radar operator at Cabourg stares at his screen, confused. "Sir, these signatures, they're too many, too low in the water." His lieutenant frowns. "Impossible. Our estimates say the Allies could not deploy so many small craft. It must be clutter." But it is not clutter. It is not decoys. It is the industrial roar of Higgins Industries expressed in steel, wood, and gasoline. Back at Omaha, Lieutenant Harrow's LCVP slams through a final line of waves. Machine gun tracers streak overhead like horizontal lightning. Harrow yanks the wheel, lining up with the landmark he memorized the night before, a crooked promontory of rock near the Vierville Draw. He glances to port and sees another LCVP cresting a wave, ramp shuddering as rounds ricochet off the bow like hail. Then another, and dozens more behind them. German defenders blink at the horizon. It is a dream turned nightmare. A swarm of craft appearing with unnatural speed, moving in water so shallow their charts had marked it as hazardous and non-navigable. Yet here they come, riding the surf, skimming over sandbars, avoiding obstacles simply because their draft is too shallow to be trapped by them. On the bluff, a Feldwebel shouts to his gunner, "Ziel C! Target the big ones!" "But they're all small," the gunner yells back. "Which is the main landing craft?" There is no main landing craft. There is only a torrent. A minute later, Harrow's ramp crashes down again, men storming into surf as if delivered by a conveyor belt of war. Inside German fire control bunkers, confusion spreads like heat. Officers frantically adjust artillery angles, recalculating firing tables. Their predictions collapse. Their timelines disintegrate. Landings they expected to happen in slow, staggered waves now occur in bursts. Platoons hitting the beach every 90 seconds. It is not the Allies' courage alone that overwhelms German defenses. It is not their ships or their planes or their tanks. It is the humble Higgins boat, appearing again and again as if conjured by the sea itself, delivering men faster than defenders can account for, undermining an entire doctrine of coastal defense. A weapon Germany never saw coming because it did not look like a weapon at all. The ramp drops again. This time it is not Omaha. It is Utah Beach, and the sun has finally pushed above the horizon. Pale gold light sweeps across the surf, catching on helmets, wet rifles, and the white-capped edges of breaking waves. The roar of naval guns behind the landing craft is a rolling thunder that shakes the ribs. But in the LCVP, piloted by Coxswain Daniel Red Malloy of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division, everything is strangely quiet in the seconds before impact. Red's knuckles tighten around the wooden wheel. His Higgins boat slices through the final surf line like a thrown stone. Around him, the sea boils with the wakes of 100 identical craft, flat-bottomed silhouettes racing toward the sand with reckless precision. A destroyer's guns bark overhead. The concussion ripples across the water like a giant's breath. Red checks his bearings. Causeway number 2, slightly south of the intended landing point. But he isn't concerned. GPS doesn't exist. The horizon is smoke. The shoreline is chaos. Higgins boats were built for exactly this: the unpredictable, the imperfect, the brutal. The shallow draft allows an LCVP to approach from angles that would wreck heavier craft. Red rides the final swell and feels the hull kiss the sand. He slams the throttle back. The soldiers rise as one. "Ramp!" Red shouts. The chains rattle. The bow slams downward. The beach explodes into life. Private Leon Mercer is first out. He feels the cold bite of water around his shins before his boots sink into sand. He hears the clatter of German MG-34s in the distance, faint, scattered, disorganized. Utah is a different beast from Omaha, less defended, more vulnerable, but it still requires speed. And speed is exactly what the Higgins boat delivers. Leon clears the ramp in 3 strides. Behind him, men pour out in a rush of boots and breath. No climbing, no sliding over metal sides, no hesitation. Straight forward, just as Andrew Higgins intended when he sketched the idea for a drop-down bow ramp years earlier in that humid Louisiana workshop. The first lieutenant of the company, his voice steady despite the storm, yells, "Form up! Move inland!" Leon risks a glance back. Behind him, Red is already reversing his engines. The LCVP coughs, spins, then backs into the surf like a horse trained to charge, deliver riders, and retreat for the next load. Within moments, as the craft pivots around, Leon sees more Higgins boats slashing toward the beach. Fresh squads, medics, radio teams, even a small bulldozer packed into one of the larger variants. It looks impossible. It feels impossible. But it's happening. Constant delivery, constant reinforcement, constant momentum. The Higgins boat is not a weapon. It is a rhythm. And that rhythm is breaking the Atlantic wall. Far offshore, Admiral Alan Kirk watches the unfolding scene through binoculars. From his command ship, he sees the pattern clearly. The landing is working because the system is working. The LCVP is not merely a craft, it is a process, a cycle, a machine for turning distance into manpower. He lowers the binoculars. "Get the next wave ready," he says. "They're landing faster than predicted." His operations officer blinks. Faster? Nothing in amphibious warfare is faster than predicted. Not with tides and reefs and sandbars and enemy fire. Yet wave after wave arrives early. Kirk knows why. He has seen Higgins boats in training. He has seen their designers' blueprints, the ramp that drops flush with the sand, the simplicity that lets even a lightly trained coxswain coax them ashore under stress. He knows that this very moment, is the culmination of a civilian idea refined into a military miracle. He murmurs under his breath, "Higgins, you mad genius." Back on Utah, German Lieutenant Rolf Stein is crouched behind a burned-out anti-tank gun. He wipes soot from his forehead, coughing as smoke rolls across the dunes. He expected a handful of landing barges. He expected a trickle of infantry. He expected time. But instead, a relentless chain. Stein watches another LCVP hit the surf. Then another, and another. The boats look like toys, bouncing on the waves, but the speed at which they deliver men is terrifying. He tries to direct his remaining machine gun crew, shouting over the din, but the sheer number of landing points overwhelms any coherent defense. The shallow draft boats bypass obstacles entirely, slipping between mines and stakes with maddening agility. They do not funnel into predictable choke points. They arrive wherever the coxswains choose. The Atlantic wall is being unraveled not by brute force alone, but by flexibility, by adaptability, by design. Stein grips his binoculars, jaw clenched, heart pounding. "What are these boats?" he whispers. No answer comes, but the truth is simple. They are the brainchild of a civilian who studied mud, water, and practicality. They are the craft Germany never anticipated. They are the reason the Allied foothold grows wider by the minute. By midday, the beaches of Normandy are a living freight line. Higgins boats shuttle constantly, bringing ammunition, engineers, tanks, and wounded men in swirling cycles. Artillery is pulled ashore on wooden planks. Radio jeeps roll down ramps. Entire supply chains breathe through these small, stubborn vessels. The LCVP was never glamorous, never sleek, never feared on its own. Yet here, in the largest amphibious assault ever attempted, it is the quiet hinge upon which the fate of Europe swings. And in every coxswain's hand, on every wooden wheel, is the invisible touch of Andrew Higgins, the swamp boat builder who solved a problem the world didn't yet know it had. Late evening, June 1944. New Orleans. Far from the thunder of Normandy, the Higgins Industries shipyard glows under rows of sodium lamps. Sparks fly from welding torches, lighting the factory floor with bursts of blue-white fire. The Mississippi River rolls dark and silent beside the plant, carrying the scent of wet silt and diesel. Inside the main assembly hall, workers push through another 18-hour shift, riveting, sanding, painting, wiring, just as they have every day for the past 2 years. They do not know yet that the boats they built are storming France. They will learn soon enough. News travels slower than production. Andrew Jackson Higgins stands on the catwalk above his workers, with a half-burned cigar clenched in the corner of his mouth. He is 60 years old, running on bad coffee, stubborn pride, and the unstoppable force of his personality. The lines on his face map decades of battles fought not in trenches, but in boardrooms, shipyards, and congressional offices. His voice is rough, his temper famous, his expectations brutal. But there is something else in him, something harder to name, a relentless certainty that what he is doing matters. A foreman jogs up the metal stairs to him. "Mr. Higgins, we just launched the 307th boat this week." Higgins grunts. "Make it 310 before sunrise." The foreman hesitates. "We can try, sir, but the men are—" 310, Higgins repeats, tapping ash over the railing. "War doesn't take breathers." He turns away and walks the length of the catwalk, surveying the army of civilians turning out the craft that will define an invasion they cannot yet picture. Each boat is handled like a living thing, rolled on greased rails, craned to the slipway, eased into the river with a trembling splash. Higgins stops beside a stack of unfinished bow ramps. He runs his hand across the thick planking. The ramp was his proudest idea, the hinge that solved the problem no naval architect could crack. Soldiers no longer had to climb over sides or jump into deep water. They sprinted straight forward. Simple, obvious, revolutionary. This ramp changed amphibious warfare forever. And tonight, though Higgins doesn't know precisely how, that ramp is crashing down on beaches under German fire. Thousands of miles away in Normandy, Captain Robert Connolly of the U.S. 29th Infantry Division sits on a makeshift bench after securing a stretch of Omaha beach. His uniform is wet with seawater, salt crusting the fabric. He hears the distant rumble of armor moving inland, the crack of occasional rifle fire, the murmur of engineers clearing lanes through obstacles. Near him, an LCVP sits beached high on the tide line, abandoned temporarily after delivering its final load. Its plywood hull is scarred, peppered with shrapnel. The drop ramp hangs half open like a tired jaw. Connolly lays a hand on the boat's flank, feeling the rough wood beneath his palm. "This little thing saved us," he says quietly. His sergeant, a broad-shouldered man from Pennsylvania, nods. "Never thought I'd trust anything made out of plywood more than a Sherman tank." Connolly smiles faintly. "Who built these?" "Some company down south. Civilian outfit." The captain shakes his head in disbelief. Here, in the biggest fight of his life, the tool that put him on the beach was not the product of admirals or academics, but the work of a man who built boats for loggers and oyster fishermen, a man who studied mud instead of military doctrine, a man who braced his designs against tree roots and sandbars instead of waves of enemy fire. And yet, that civilian's insight now shapes every inch of this coast. Connolly pats the hull once more, almost affectionately. "Whoever he is, he built the right damn thing." Back in New Orleans, midnight creeps over the factory. Workers file out for a short break, laughing, smoking, collapsing onto crates. In the corner of the yard, two welders listen to a tinny radio. A reporter's voice crackles through. "Large-scale Allied landings on the French coast began at dawn today. American, British, and Canadian troops. Landing craft reported to be in continuous operation." The welders freeze. Landing craft. Continuous operation. They look at one another with dawning realization. "Those are ours," one whispers. The other nods slowly. The radio continues. "Craft capable of approaching shallow beaches under heavy fire." Shallow beaches. Craft. Higgins' craft. Men begin gathering around the radio. Riveters, painters, clerks, crane operators. Someone turns up the volume. Someone else removes his cap. The yard goes quiet except for the faint hum of machinery. Instrumental to the success of the initial assault. A murmur ripples through the crowd. Then someone shouts from the back, "That's our boys! That's our boats!" Cheers erupt across the factory. Men pound each other's backs. Women wipe their eyes. Young welders grin like they've just been told they helped move mountains. Above them on the catwalk, Higgins steps into the glow of a lamp, cigar burning low. He doesn't cheer. He doesn't smile. He simply stands there in the noise and pride and heat, staring at his workers, at his boats, at the river that has carried thousands of LCVPs toward a war he cannot see but feels in his bones. He whispers to himself, "Give 'em hell, boys." The world will one day call Andrew Higgins the man who won the war for America. Dwight D. Eisenhower will praise him publicly. Historians will write books about him. Generals will swear by his boats. But on this night, Higgins is just a stubborn, brilliant shipbuilder watching the thing he created become something far bigger than he ever imagined. And on the far shores of France, those small, fast, shallow draft boats are doing exactly what he designed them to do. Deliver victory, one ramp drop at a time. June 6, 1944, Normandy. German Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Ammler stared through his rangefinder, unable to make sense of what he was seeing. At first, the horizon was empty, just the gray blur of the channel, mist rising off the water. Then, as the light shifted, he saw them. Dozens at first, then hundreds. Small silhouettes rushing forward in tight formations, cutting across the waves far faster and far shallower than any German naval officer had ever expected Allied landing craft to move. He barked orders to his men on the bluff above Omaha Beach, but they were just as confused. These weren't deep-hulled transports. They weren't the lumbering British LCAs they had studied in intelligence briefings. These things skimmed the water like hunting birds, and they kept coming. Inside one of those boats, U.S. Army Staff Sergeant William Bill Corrigan gripped the metal bar overhead as the craft slammed down on another rising swell. The ramp in front rattled, chains grinding, salt spray coating every helmet and rifle. Corrigan had done the drills in England, climbing down cargo nets into the boats again and again. But the real thing felt different, louder, faster, violent. But the Higgins boat held. The coxswain, hands tight on the throttle, jaw clenched, kept the flat-bottomed hull knifing forward even as German artillery began to bracket the water. Other craft might have slowed, risked grounding, or turned off course. Not this one. The square bow punched through the surf until the keel finally scraped sand. "Drop the ramp!" the coxswain roared. The metal front slammed down, and daylight burst into the craft. Corrigan surged forward with his squad, boots splashing into waist-deep water. They were already firing before they cleared the ramp. Behind them, another Higgins boat was landing, and another, and another. From the German viewpoint above, it looked impossible, like entire battalions were materializing straight out of the ocean. Ammler yelled into his field telephone, trying to tell his command what was happening, but even as he spoke, he didn't understand it himself. These shallow draft craft were landing troops at a speed no German defensive plan accounted for. The Atlantic Wall had been designed for slow, predictable approaches, not for Higgins's swamp boat-turned-war machine. On Utah Beach, Navy Rear Admiral Carlton Bryant watched the flow of men and vehicles pouring ashore and knew instantly that the design had paid off. Higgins boats delivered infantry in seconds, not minutes. They touched sand, dropped their ramps, and reversed out, ready to bring in the next wave. Engineers, tanks fitted with flotation gear, medics, radio men, everyone moved because the boats never stopped. It was industrial rhythm, combat choreography, a machine designed by a man who wasn't a soldier or a naval architect, but who understood the language of water. By noon, more than 130,000 Allied troops were ashore. German officers, stunned at the sheer speed of the landings, sent increasingly frantic reports up the chain. "The Americans are landing faster than we can destroy them. They are bypassing obstacles that should have halted them. Their craft are too shallow to hit. Our guns cannot target them." To them, it felt like the Allies had rewritten the physics of amphibious war. But the truth was simpler and more unbelievable. They were watching the result of one civilian's stubbornness, his refusal to listen to experts who said invasion craft had to be deep, heavy, and slow. Higgins proved them wrong, and now, on the most important day of the war, His swamp-born creation was rewriting history. As the tide rose and Higgins boats continued their relentless shuttle, Corrigan paused behind a sand dune, catching his breath. Machine gun fire cracked overhead. Mortars thumped. But behind him, more ramps crashed down. More soldiers poured forward. He realized something that the Germans were realizing too late. The Allies hadn't just invaded France. They had arrived in force, faster than anyone had believed possible, and the little wooden craft beneath their feet was the reason why. By late afternoon, with the June sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, German General Lieutenant Wilhelm Richter stepped into a bunker carved into the cliffs above Utah Beach. The air inside was hot and stale, filled with angry voices arguing over maps and radio transcripts, but all of them fell silent when another transmission crackled through the static. A coastal artillery officer shouted over the line, "They are landing faster than we can fire. These boats, they come in waves without pause." Richter frowned. That didn't make sense. Amphibious assaults came in staggered intervals, minutes, sometimes hours between major waves. Troop transports had to circle, reposition, wait for tide conditions. The Allies couldn't simply press forward endlessly. Except they were. He stepped outside the bunker and looked through his binoculars toward the surf. What he saw shifted something in him. Something cold and unmistakable. The landing craft weren't stopping. They weren't hesitating. They weren't bottlenecking at obstacles the way German planners had predicted. They simply skimmed over the shallows, touched sand, expelled troops, and sped back into the surf for more. A conveyor belt of invasion. Under his boots, the ground shook from the distant rumble of Allied armor being unloaded. Sherman tanks, bulldozers, artillery pieces. This wasn't a beachhead forming slowly and cautiously. This was a machine running at full industrial capacity. He muttered under his breath, barely audible, "This is not the craft we prepared for." Behind him, an aide ran up, pale-faced, clutching a printed report. "Herr General, Panzer units are requesting reinforcements. They say the Americans have already landed at least 8,000 men at this sector alone. They're using small boats, many hundreds. Our gunners cannot stop them." Richter didn't respond. Because he knew. The failure wasn't the guns or the men. It was the assumption they had all shared, that amphibious warfare would move at 1917 speed, that physics and engineering placed natural limits on how fast an invading force could unload. But these craft, these shallow draft wooden boxes with roaring engines, had shredded that assumption. Meanwhile, just beyond the surf, coxswain Jacob Red Halverson spun the wheel of his Higgins boat hard to starboard, letting the last traces of rocket fire sputter into the water behind him. He glanced over his shoulder as medics prepared the wounded man they'd just evacuated, something the boat could do almost as easily as landing troops. He gunned the throttle again, weaving between other LCVPs, racing back to the troop ships. To him it was all motion, all rhythm, land, drop, reverse, return, repeat. It felt almost mechanical, like being part of a living, moving engine. But he never forgot what had started it, a boat designed to climb over obstacles instead of plowing into them. A boat meant for swamps, but reborn for war. Back on the cliffs, Richter watched as yet another line of these boats streaked toward shore. His stomach tightened. The battle was only hours old, yet he could already see the outcome forming. "There," he said quietly, lowering his binoculars, "is the difference between a nation ready for this war and one that is not." He knew the truth that upper command would not want to hear. By the time the 1st German divisions fully understood what the Higgins boat could do, the beaches of Normandy were already lost. The realization spread up the chain, slow at first, then fast, like a bitter aftertaste carried through every radio message that night. The American landing craft are too fast, too numerous, too unstoppable. Germany had prepared for a storm. Instead, Higgins had delivered a flood. Night had finally fallen on Normandy. Fires still burned along the bluffs, tracers arced across the sky, and the rumble of distant naval guns rolled over the water like thunder. But down on the sand, where hours earlier chaos had reigned, another sound was taking over. Engines, dozens of them. The Higgins boats were still moving. U.S. Navy Lieutenant Commander Roscoe Marr stood knee-deep in the surf, directing the last wave of supply craft with a red-lensed flashlight. Behind him, stacks of ammunition crates, ration boxes, and radio sets were piling higher by the minute. The beachmasters, men whose job it was to organize this floating factory, were shouting orders over the roar of diesel engines. But there was something electric in their voices. They all knew they had seen something extraordinary today. A system, improvised by a man who had never worn a uniform, had delivered an army onto French soil with unstoppable momentum. Marr turned as another pair of Higgins boats slid ashore, this time carrying engineers and their demolition gear. The ramps slammed down, men poured out, and within seconds the boats were reversing again, engines churning sand and foam. It was a perfect cycle, executed again and again with near mathematical precision. One captain beside Marr said, half awed, half exhausted, "Damn things run like they're made of clockwork." Marr laughed softly. "Not clockwork," he said. "Hurricane swamp water. That's what Higgins built 'em for." And that was the heart of it. Andrew Jackson. Higgins, shipbuilder, troublemaker, problem solver, had never intended to design the most important boat of the 20th century. He just needed something to move lumber through Louisiana marshes. Something that could bounce off sandbars, skim over mudflats, and turn tighter than any Navy craft. But when the Marines couldn't find a boat that could land on a Pacific beach without tearing itself apart, when the Army needed something that could survive coral reefs, when the Navy realized its existing landing craft ran too deep, Higgins pointed to his old swamp design and said, "Try this." Washington laughed at him. The Navy dismissed him, the experts ignored him, and Higgins, furious, built them anyway. By 1942, the military wasn't laughing. By 1943, they were begging for more. And by 1944, tonight, on this beach in Normandy, every soldier who had climbed down a cargo net and into one of those wooden hulls owed his life to the man who refused to take no for an answer. Marr squinted toward the incoming tide of more landing craft, supplies, fuel, field kitchens, even chaplains and medics. The boats didn't care what they carried. They just kept coming. Somewhere far behind the lines, inside a German command post, that same relentlessness was being studied with mounting dread. Reports were piling up. "Their boats operate in water too shallow for our mines. Troops are landing at triple the expected rate. Environmental obstacles ineffective." The Atlantic Wall had been built on assumptions. Higgins had shattered all of them. Nearby, a group of infantrymen sat on overturned crates, helmets off, eating their first hot food since dawn. One of them, Private Charles Doyle, stared at the surf with a tired smile. "You know," he said between bites of K-ration stew, "those boats didn't look like much when we first saw 'em, but out there—" He gestured toward the water. "Out there they were like angels with engines." Another soldier nodded. "Without them, we'd still be sitting on the troop ship waiting our turn." A third man laughed. "What troop ship? We emptied half the channel today." They were right, and they didn't even know the half of it. By midnight, nearly 150,000 Allied troops were ashore, not because of better weather or better timing or better luck, but because the Higgins boat turned the world's largest invasion from a dangerous gamble into a functional assembly line. Andrew Higgins wasn't on the beach that night. He wasn't even in Europe. He was thousands of miles away in New Orleans, still arguing with suppliers, still pushing factories to build faster, still trying to solve tomorrow's problems before today's were finished. But his fingerprints were everywhere. On every ramp, every engine, every plank of plywood, reinforced with marine glue and stubbornness. And on the bluffs above, German officers realized the truth with dawning horror. They had misjudged the Allied soldier. They had misjudged Allied industry. But their greatest mistake was misjudging Andrew Higgins. Because while they dug trenches and built bunkers, Higgins had built a way around all of it. A way to make the Atlantic Wall obsolete. A way to rewrite the fate of Europe. And a way to deliver an army faster than any defender could comprehend. June 7, 1944. First light. A soft gray glow crept over the Normandy coastline, revealing the aftermath of the most ambitious seaborne invasion in human history. Smoke rose in pillars. Burned-out bunkers smoldered. The sand, once a killing field, was now a sprawling camp of medics, engineers, signalmen, and infantry preparing for the push inland. But out past the surf, the sight was even more extraordinary. Higgins boats, hundreds of them, were still at work. Some carried wounded back to hospital ships, others ferried jeeps and radio trucks ashore. A few brought coffee and ammunition to the front-line units already moving down the causeways. Their engines growled through the dawn like tireless beasts, running a route they had memorized in the chaos of yesterday's landing. Standing near the waterline, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley watched the operation unfold with a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. The night had been brutal, the casualties heavy, but the beachhead had not only held, it had expanded. And the reason was simple: velocity. Higgins boats had turned a fragile toehold into a constant forward motion. Every minute, every tide cycle, every wave mattered. And the LCVPs had made sure no moment went wasted. Bradley's aide approached with a clipboard. "Sir, estimates put total landings near 156,000 men. Most arrived within 12 hours. Bradley nodded slowly. "And the Germans? They didn't understand how we were moving so many so fast." Bradley allowed himself a rare smile. "They weren't meant to." Up on the bluffs, in the broken remains of a command post, a German staff officer scribbled a final note into his logbook. One historians would one day quote, "baffled and astonished." "The enemy's landing craft do not behave like naval vessels. We cannot predict their movement. Their shallow hulls land troops in places we thought impassable." He paused, tapping the pencil against the paper as if searching for the right words. "Our defenses were built for an older war." And that was the truth at the heart of it. World War II had always been as much a clash of assumptions as it was a clash of armies. German commanders assumed the Allies would land slowly, assumed deep hulls would fail on sandbars, assumed the Atlantic Wall would force invaders into predictable paths. But Higgins had built a machine that played by none of those rules. Down on the beach, Staff Sergeant Bill Corrigan, still alive after the hell of Omaha, watched another line of Higgins boats churn through the surf. He rubbed grit from his eyes and felt the weight of what had happened settle over him. "They'll write about this," he muttered to a corporal beside him. "They'll say it was tanks, or planes, or luck." The corporal shrugged. "Maybe, but none of us walked this far inland without those damn boats." Corrigan smiled wearily. "Higgins should get a medal." He didn't know that President Eisenhower would one day say, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us." He didn't know that historians would later call the Higgins boat the most important piece of amphibious equipment in World War II. He didn't know that German intelligence officers, reading reports from Normandy, would admit privately that their coastal defense strategy had been undone by a vessel they had barely bothered to study. All he knew was the truth every soldier on the beach now felt in their bones. The LCVP had taken them where no other craft could. And because of that, because of Higgins, Europe had a future again. Far away in New Orleans, Andrew Higgins walked across the factory floor that morning as he always did. The radio played war updates. His workers kept building, sanding, hammering. Another batch of boats was already being prepared for shipment. He nodded at a foreman, inspected a hull, then paused for a moment hands resting on the warm plywood. Maybe he didn't know that his design had just changed the course of history, or maybe he always knew it would, for in the end, the Higgins boat was more than an invention, more than a vessel, more than a landing craft. It was a bridge between impossible and inevitable. And on June 6, 1944, the world crossed it.